Yes, but only because you signed your notes. Every page, I might add. A little egotistical, don't you think?
Isolation for the E5 can be understood not only in the sense of behavioral isolation from the social world, but the process of separating the experience from their own internal world. Contradictory thoughts, roles, or attitudes coexist in the conscious psyche without them being aware of the contradiction. For the Enneagram 5, this explains how feelings of grandiosity and inferiority can coexist, as well as both positive and negative perceptions of others. Isolation in this character is built on detachment, not only from other people, but the world itself. Detachment depends on the isolation from feelings, inactivating them and avoiding the situation in which feelings normally arise, an interruption of the life process in the service of feeling avoidance. The Enneatype 5 seeks to dull their emotional life in order to reduce their ordinary human need for contact. Avoidance of action in the Type 5 can also be seen as a way of avoiding feeling and as an isolation mechanism, as this is a process of interrupting thoughts through mental blocking, separating thoughts from emotion. Where there is a remoteness, not only from others but also from the world, action is unnecessary. And conversely, the avoidance of action supports the avoidance of relationships. The Type 5 is the opposite of the Type 8 and its lusty superabundance, and thus we are invited to think about the mechanism of splitting as a defensive way of protecting themselves against a primitive and impulsive response to the environment. This type separates itself analytically in order to view the situation unrelated to himself and his emotions. This means that he limits and diminishes his personal needs. Projection in this context attributes to others motives, feelings, and thoughts that are not acknowledged within oneself. In some cases, it can be self-actualization that is disowned, the idea that ill will comes from an outer source. The E6 has a constant feeling of being watched and judged by its outer world. This causes the E6 to become overly suspicious of things. They externalize this into outer relationships, turning their suspicion onto the other. In other cases, the E6 refuses to accept their own impulses, and therefore these are disowned and attributed to others. Self-condemnation becomes accusation of another. Projection can be understood as a mental operation that aims to push blame away from the person and onto the outer world. The E6 wants to put the excessive guilt they feel onto something else as a way to deflect from this guilt. This is known as identification with the aggressor. The Enneagram 6 seeks to placate his enemy through becoming an enemy to himself. They believe that if they adopt a self-accusing attitude, then they will not fall into trouble with authority. Self-accusation typically sees monstrosity where there is only nature, to the extent that fear is a part of the universal neurosis. By imagining this monstrosity where there is potential spontaneity and the wisdom of the organism, leads to the E6 to turn to self-vilification.
ようこそ最後のゲーム会場へ
Naranjo states that there is more than one defense mechanism which can be pertinent to the hedonistic narcissistic character. Early on in life, the E7 employs the ability to excuse his indulgence through good reason, which implies that the mechanism of rationalization is an important strategy in his life. Ernest Jones describes rationalization as an invention of a reason for an attitude or action where the motive is not acknowledged. This is a mechanism for distraction against the real reason as to why they act. They refuse to acknowledge their motivations and actions. They satisfy the demands of their superego by making themselves appear good and noble. The hedonistic narcissistic character uses their persuasion as a way to avoid what they see as obstacles in the way of seeking pleasure. Naranjo argues that rationalization as a defense mechanism may just be to support their idealization. Self-idealization in the E7 is tied to their denial of guilt, leading their behavior to come across as self-propagandizing. However, when in relation to authority figures, the E7 typically uses a de-idealizing attitude. This is because they are actively anti-hierarchical, so they employ the opposite approach. For the E7, this optimistic attitude becomes second nature due to the fact that they navigate the world without this idealization of it. For the E7, there is a strong attachment to the belief that I'm okay, you're okay. If everything is good for them, then it must be good for everyone else.